You know, we have long thought and said this president is a smart man. It may be time to revisit that assumption. To President Carter, I want to issue a sincere apology. It is no longer fair to say he was the worst president of this great country in my lifetime. President Obama has proven me wrong.
Now, there is something we have heard from the right a lot these past 5 years. I thought Jimmy Carter was bad, but he's nothing compared to how bad this guy is. It's a line that gets trotted out all the time as a way for the right to portray Obama as some kind of inept socialist ideologue who's going to drive the country to ruin.
It was the most anti-small business administration I've seen probably since Carter. Who would have guessed we'd look back at the Carter years as the good old days? You know, it's...
And this has been the right's refrain throughout President Obama's time in office. And in fact, it's not actually just President Obama. It has been the refrain from the right for just about every Democrat seeking major office since Jimmy Carter left the White House.
So when you hear tax the rich, Mr. and Mrs. America, watch your wallet. Lock your wallet, because he's coming right after you, just like Jimmy Carter did, and just like you're going to end up with interest rates at 21%, and you're going to have inflation going through the roof.
That was President George H.W. Bush invoking the Carter comparison against Bill Clinton back in 1992. That was 22 years ago. Now, as a tactic, this all makes sense. Carter presided over an economically traumatic part of American history. High unemployment, soaring inflation, brutal interest rates, gas lines. There's also the endless Iran hostage crisis. When he ran for re-election in 1980, Carter lost 44 states. So strategically, I get it. Equate the current Democratic president with a past Democratic president whose tenure is not generally remembered well. But there are two things that bother me about it. The first is just how far off the right's caricature of Carter is from reality. Because the way they tell it, he failed because he was some kind of radical European-style president who was pursuing a far-left agenda. You know, just like that far-left agenda that Barack Obama is supposedly pursuing. But that is not true at all. Because Carter, at least when he was president, was actually a pretty conservative Democrat. He had tense relationships with the Democratic Party's traditional coalition groups. He resisted expansive government programs. He dismantled regulations on major industries. Unions considered him hostile to them. One historian has called Carter the most conservative Democratic president since Grover Cleveland. And his conservatism created a deep and bitter split in his own party. And it was that split that gave rise to Ted Kennedy's primary challenge to Carter in 1980. That was a liberal senator rallying the party's traditional base against a sitting president they believed to be too far to the right. Now, Kennedy lost that challenge, but 3 decades after Carter left office, there was still obvious animosity between him and Kennedy. In 2010, at the height of the health care debate, Carter was still taking digs at Kennedy, telling CBS, "The fact is that we would have had comprehensive health care now had it not been for Ted Kennedy's deliberately blocking the legislation I proposed. It was his fault. Ted Kennedy killed the bill." That was not a president, Jimmy Carter, who led a unified party or who was in lockstep with its liberal wing. That Carter was ever nominated by the Democratic Party in the first place itself, that's a credit to his savviness. As long before the powerful forces in his party, he was the one who grasped the significance of what in 1976 was a radically expanded primary season. He amassed momentum in delegates very early that made him unstoppable. And when the rest of his party realized what he was pulling off, well, it was too late to stop him, and he had the nomination. So that's what bothers me, the history of it. We can debate the Carter presidency, but the caricature of him that Republicans have been relying on as our first socialist president is just totally off base. But the simpler question is this. It has been 33 years since Jimmy Carter left office. So why are Republicans so intent on still beating him up, and why are they obsessed with trying to turn every Democratic president into another Jimmy Carter? Well, joining us now is Jonathan Alter. He's MSNBC, I'll get that out, political analyst. He's also the author of The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies. Jonathan, thanks for being here tonight. I'll point out right away, thank you for wearing the sweater. It's very appropriate in a Carter conversation.
That's right.
It's not quite the cardigan, but it's pretty close.
Didn't intend it that way.
But well, an unintentional but still fortunate decision. So I guess let's just start with that question. I always wonder, when you see Bobby Jindal doing this at CPAC, bringing up Carter, Donald Trump also brought brought him up and
Right.
called him the late, great Jimmy Carter, and forgetting that Jimmy Carter is still alive, very much alive. But is that something, it clearly means something to the audience there. Does that have resonance outside of that room, outside of the conservative
I
base?
really don't think it does, because just do the math. So they picked this idea up from the Democrats, who beat up on Herbert Hoover for many years after FDR beat Hoover. But 33 years after Hoover was president was the late 1960s, and it wasn't like Democrats were using Hoover against, Nixon and Reagan and the Bushes. By that time, it wasn't working anymore. So think about how long ago it was that Carter was president. If you're under 50, you barely remember him. If you're under 35, you were barely born when Carter was president. So this is a message to the Republican base of elderly people, and it really doesn't resonate anymore anyway. And as you point out, it's factually inaccurate about the Carter presidency, which was not a successful presidency, but not for the reasons that they describe. And I kind of lived a little bit of this. I was an intern in the Jimmy Carter White House when I was in college, and then after college, I felt he was too conservative for me, and I went and worked for Ted Kennedy in 1980. And there were quite a number of other liberals at the time who did the same thing, because we thought that Carter wasn't liberal enough.
So you sort of embody that split we were talking about in 1980.
So, it just completely ignores Carter's main foreign policy accomplishment, which remains one of the greatest achievements in American foreign policy of the last 50 years, which was the Camp David Accords of 1978, which Egypt still respects. They continue to recognize Israel's right to exist. So they're beating up on him this week in like a foreign policy context, I guess because of the failed Iran hostage.
But what I wonder when I look at this too is if there's an aspect of, we talk about how the right has sort of changed Carter's image from, he was the president who was sort of too conservative, that his reputation, at least among Democrats in the late 70s, and now he's our first socialist president.
Right.
That kind of revisionism, that sort of happened with Ronald Reagan too, right? Like the Reagan of the 1980s was a lot different. The Reagan who actually governed this country is a lot different from the sort of almost caricature version of him that conservatives sort of celebrate now. And I wonder if those two are not linked, right? Like, Ronald Reagan, to become the heroic figure that they've built him up to be, had to succeed as president, somebody who was an absolute total failure. So you can't have the Reagan legend without Carter being just the worst thing ever.
Yeah, and on top of that, and this is something I write about some in the Center Holds, is that the Romney people in 2012 were certain, right up to election night, that this was going to be a repeat of 1980 with Obama as Carter and Mitt Romney as Ronald Reagan, and that there would be this huge wave. People forget that Carter was expected to get reelected until very close to the 1980 election, and then there was this huge wave of disgust with him, and Reagan was swept into office. So they would actually talk explicitly in 2012 about the Carter-Reagan analogy, and of course it didn't turn out that way.
Right. That's right. In 1980, there was the assumption that Reagan was too conservative to win the general election right up until...
Right. And the other factor, Steve, I think at play here is that as ex-president, and Carter has set the pace for being a great ex-president, he's been essentially a pacifist who's gone around the world making peace, supervising elections, curing diseases, doing all kinds of liberal things, which are good things that the Republicans are trying to make now seem as if somehow discredit that it would have been better if you'd been playing golf and making money.
Still at it at 89 years old, which is something I think Donald Trump didn't get the memo on. Anyway, Jonathan Alter, the MSNBC political analyst and author of The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
The news again that we are monitoring throughout the hour, though, is the missing Malaysia Airlines 777 airplane. Malaysia flight MH370 lost contact with air traffic control between Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. Search and rescue mission is underway, and there are more details that we'll bring to you as soon as we get them. So stick around, stay with us.